The letter arrived on the same day I had to choose between buying cat food and paying the electric bill. For 3 years, my animal shelter had survived on donations from one mysterious benefactor. And now, she was dead. Her final gift came with an impossible condition. To inherit $3 million, I had to find a home for one last animal, her beloved three-legged, impossibly grumpy cat named Churchill. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, what's the name of your first pet? Drop it in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Now, let's go back to the day that changed everything. The morning started like every other morning at Paws and Heart's animal shelter, with chaos, hope, and the persistent smell of disinfectant that no amount of air freshener could mask. I had just medicated a one-eyed beagle named Buster when my assistant, Mason, burst through the door holding an official-looking envelope. "Violet, this just came by courier," he said, slightly out of breath. "It's from some fancy law firm downtown." I set down the syringe and wiped my hands on my scrubs, my heart immediately sinking. Legal correspondence was never good news for a struggling nonprofit. We were already 3 months behind on our lease, and I'd been dodging calls from our veterinary supply company for weeks. "Probably another bill," I muttered, tearing open the envelope. "Or maybe they're finally shutting us down." But as I read the letter, my legs gave out, and I had to sit down on the examination table next to Buster, who seemed concerned by my sudden change in demeanor. "What is it?" Mason asked, alarmed by my expression. It's from the law firm representing our anonymous donor." "She's dead, Mason. Mrs. Ashworth is dead." For 3 years, Cordelia Ashworth had been the guardian angel of Paws and Hearts. Every month, like clockwork, a check would arrive, always exactly enough to keep us afloat. She'd covered our rent, our veterinary bills, our food costs, and the salaries for our small staff. Without her, we would have closed within 6 months of opening. I'd tried to contact her directly dozens of times, wanting to thank her personally, but her lawyers had always maintained that she preferred to remain anonymous. All I knew was that she was an elderly woman who loved animals and believed in our mission. "What does the letter say about the donations?" Mason asked gently. I continued reading, my hands shaking. "It says, oh my God, Mason, it says she's left the shelter $3 million. Mason's jaw dropped. $3 million? Are you serious? "But there's a condition," I continued, my excitement deflating as I read further. "I have to meet with her lawyer tomorrow to discuss the terms of the inheritance." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment above the shelter, listening to the familiar sounds of our overnight residents, the soft whimpering of anxious dogs, the occasional meow from the cat room, and the rustle of small animals in their cages. $3 million would change everything. We could expand, hire more staff, save more animals. We could become the kind of shelter I'd always dreamed of running. But I'd learned long ago that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. The offices of Pemberton, Hayes & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper that probably cost more to maintain each month than my shelter's entire annual budget. I felt completely out of place in my best dress, a simple black number I'd bought at a thrift store for my college graduation 5 years earlier. The receptionist, a perfectly polished woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, directed me to a conference room where a distinguished man in his 60s was waiting. He stood when I entered, extending a manicured hand. "Miss Thornton, I'm Harold Pemberton. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The conference room was intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a table that could seat 20 people, and walls lined with law books. Mr. Pemberton sat across from me, a thick folder in front of him. "First, let me express Mrs. Ashworth's gratitude for the work you've been doing," he began. "She followed your shelter's progress very closely and was deeply impressed by your dedication to animal welfare." I wish I could have thanked her personally. Her donations kept us alive. She knew that, and she was very proud of what you accomplished with her support. Which brings us to why you're here. He opened the folder and pulled out a document. Mrs. Ashworth has indeed left your shelter a substantial bequest, $3 million to be exact. My heart leaped, but Mr. Pemberton's serious expression kept my excitement in check. However, there is one condition that must be met before the funds can be released. What kind of condition? Mr. Pemberton pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed an enormous orange tab cat with distinctive white markings and, I noticed, only 3 legs. The cat's expression in the photo could only be described as deeply annoyed. This is Churchill. He was Mrs. Ashworth's beloved companion for the past 12 years. He lost his front left leg in an accident when he was young, but that hasn't slowed him down much. What has made him challenging is his personality. Challenging how? Churchill is, to put it diplomatically, not fond of strangers, or change, or really anything that disrupts his very specific routine. Mrs. Ashworth was the only person he tolerated, and even she had to earn his trust over many months. I studied the photograph more closely. Churchill was undeniably handsome, with bright green eyes and a magnificent coat, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was plotting something unpleasant. The condition of your inheritance, Mr. Pemberton continued, is that you must find Churchill a suitable home within 30 days. Not just any home, a loving, permanent home where he will be cared for properly for the rest of his life. That doesn't sound too difficult, I said, though something in Mr. Pemberton's expression suggested otherwise. Miss Thornton, I feel I should warn you, Churchill has been through 4 different boarding facilities since Mrs. Ashworth's death 3 weeks ago. He's been asked to leave each one. Asked to leave? He bit a veterinary technician at the first place, a bite so deep he had to get stitches. At the second, he somehow managed to open all the cage doors in the cat room, releasing 37 cats into the facility. The third place said he was psychologically disturbing the other animals. And the fourth, he paused. The fourth place called him a furry demon sent from hell. I stared at the photograph again. Churchill stared back, his green eyes seeming to challenge me through the paper. Where is he now? In a temporary boarding situation that's costing the estate $500 a day. The owner is a friend of mine who specializes in difficult cases. But even she says Churchill can't stay much longer. Mr. Pemberton leaned forward, his expression serious. Miss Thornton, I want to be completely honest with you. Mrs. Ashworth knew this wouldn't be easy. In fact, I believe she chose this condition specifically because it would be challenging. She wanted to ensure that whoever inherited her fortune truly understood the commitment required to care for animals that others might consider undesirable. And if I can't find him a home in 30 days? Then the money goes to a large national animal welfare organization instead. Your shelter receives nothing. I felt the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. $3 million could save hundreds, maybe thousands of animals over the years. But it all depended on finding one grumpy 3-legged cat a home. Can I meet him? I asked. Mr. Pemberton smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. I was hoping you'd ask. Mrs. Ashworth left very specific instructions about Churchill's care, and she wanted whoever took on this challenge to understand exactly what they were dealing with. An hour later, I found myself standing outside Whiskers and Wag's luxury pet resort, a facility that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a boarding kennel. The owner, a woman named Patricia Kellerman, met me at the front desk with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and relief. You must be Violet, she said, shaking my hand. I have to say, I'm impressed you're willing to take this on. Churchill is, well, you'll see. She led me through a series of immaculately clean corridors, lined with spacious suites for dogs and cats. The facility was beautiful, with classical music playing softly and the kind of amenities that most humans would envy. "He's in our isolation suite," Patricia explained as we walked. "Not because he's sick, but because he kept terrorizing the other guests. Yesterday, he's somehow figured out how to turn on the sprinkler system in the dog wing. We're still not sure how he managed it with only 3 legs." We stopped in front of a door marked Private Suite 12. Through the window, I could see a large orange cat sitting regally on a velvet cushion, his back turned to the door in a gesture of obvious disdain. "Churchill," Patricia called softly, "you have a visitor." The cat's ears twitched, but he didn't turn around. "He's been like this since he arrived," Patricia said. "He eats, he uses his litter box, he sleeps, but he won't interact with anyone. It's like he's in mourning." I studied Churchill through the window. Despite his reputation for mayhem, there was something deeply sad about his posture. He looked like a king who'd lost his kingdom. "Can I go in?" Patricia hesitated. "I should warn you, he's not friendly. The last person who tried to pet him needed 6 stitches. I'll be careful." Patricia unlocked the door, and I stepped into the suite. It was larger than my bedroom, with expensive furniture, toys, and a window overlooking a garden. Churchill finally turned to look at me, and I was struck by how beautiful his green eyes were. This wasn't just an angry cat. This was a grieving animal who'd lost the only person he'd ever trusted. "Hello, Churchill," I said softly, sitting down on the floor a few feet away from him. "I'm Violet. I knew your mom, sort of. She helped take care of a lot of animals like you." Churchill studied me for a long moment, then deliberately turned his back to me again. I spent the next hour sitting in that room talking quietly to Churchill about Mrs. Ashworth, about the shelter, about the animals we cared for. He never acknowledged me directly, but I noticed that his ears were always turned in my direction, listening. When I finally left, Patricia walked me to the parking lot. "He didn't try to attack you," she said, sounding surprised. "That's actually progress." "He's not mean," I said, thinking about what I'd observed. "He's heartbroken." That evening, I sat in my office at the shelter, staring at Churchill's photograph and trying to figure out how to find a home for a cat that most people would consider unadoptable. I'd been in animal rescue long enough to know that senior cats were hard to place under the best circumstances. A senior cat with a disability and behavioral issues, that was nearly impossible. But $3 million was a lot of motivation. I started by reaching out to my network of experienced cat adopters, people who'd successfully adopted difficult animals before. The responses were polite but firm. A 3-legged cat was one thing. A 3-legged cat with a biting problem was another entirely. "I'm sorry, Violet," said Mrs. Moore, who'd adopted 3 senior cats from us over the years. "I'd love to help, but I have grandchildren who visit. I can't risk having an aggressive cat in the house." The story was the same everywhere I called. People were sympathetic, but no one was willing to take on Churchill's challenges. After a week of rejections, I decided to try a different approach. I brought Churchill to the shelter. Patricia was reluctant to let him go. "Are you sure about this? He's been relatively calm here, but a new environment might set him off. He needs to be around people if we're going to find him a home. And I want to work with him myself, see if I can help him with his socialization issues." The transport went better than expected. Churchill sat quietly in his carrier, watching the world go by through the mesh door. When we arrived at the shelter, he emerged cautiously, sniffing the air and taking in his new surroundings. I'd prepared a special room for him, quiet, comfortable, with all his favorite things from Mrs. Ashworth's house. Churchill explored methodically, checking every corner before settling on a sunny windowsill where he could observe the shelter's activities. "He's beautiful," Mason said, admiring Churchill from a safe distance. "But he looks like he's planning something." "He's just scared," I said. though I had to admit Churchill's expression was rather calculating. Over the next few days, I spent every spare moment with Churchill trying to earn his trust. I brought him gourmet food, expensive toys, and even a cashmere blanket that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a month. Churchill accepted these offerings with the air of a king receiving tribute, but he remained aloof. The breakthrough came on day 4, when I was cleaning his room and accidentally knocked over a water bowl. As I scrambled to clean up the mess, muttering apologies, I heard a sound I hadn't expected, a low, rumbling purr. I looked up to find Churchill watching me with what might have been amusement. For just a moment, his guard was down, and I saw the cat he must have been with Mrs. Ashworth, playful, intelligent, maybe even affectionate. "You think that's funny, do you?" I said, and Churchill's purr grew louder. From that moment on, our relationship began to change. Churchill started following me around the shelter, always maintaining a careful distance, but clearly interested in what I was doing. He seemed particularly fascinated by the other animals, watching through the glass as I worked with dogs and cats who were waiting for homes. But his behavior with potential adopters remained problematic. The first family who came to meet him, a lovely couple in their 60s who'd specifically requested a senior cat, left after Churchill hissed at them for 10 minutes straight. "Maybe he just needs more time," the woman said diplomatically, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The second family didn't even make it into his room. Churchill took one look at their young children and began what could only be described as a war cry, a sound so loud and menacing that the kids started crying. By the end of the second week, I was getting desperate. I'd contacted every cat rescue organization within 100 miles, posted on social media, and even reached out to specialty groups that dealt with disabled animals. The responses were always the same: sympathy, but no takers. "Maybe we should consider that this might not be possible," Mason suggested gently after another failed adoption attempt. "I mean, $3 million is a lot of money, but if Churchill can't be placed—" "There has to be someone," I said stubbornly. Mrs. Ashworth wouldn't have set an impossible task. She believed Churchill could find a home, and I have to believe that too. But privately, I was starting to have doubts. With only 2 weeks left, I was running out of options and running out of hope. That's when I decided to try something different. Instead of bringing people to meet Churchill, I would take Churchill to meet people. Maybe in a more relaxed environment, away from the shelter, he might show his better side. The first home visit was with Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a retired veterinarian who lived alone in a beautiful Victorian house filled with cat trees and toys. She'd expressed interest in Churchill despite his reputation, saying she'd dealt with difficult animals her entire career. I loaded Churchill into his carrier along with his favorite blanket and some treats, and drove to Dr. Whitfield's house. She met us at the door with a warm smile and the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of working with animals. "So, this is the famous Churchill," she said, peering into the carrier. "He's quite handsome, isn't he?" I carried the carrier into her living room, which was clearly designed with cats in mind. There were perches by every window, scratching posts in every corner, and the kind of expensive cat furniture that most people couldn't afford. "This looks perfect for him," I said, setting the carrier down and opening the door. Churchill emerged slowly, his nose twitching as he took in the new scents. For a moment, I thought this might actually work. He seemed calm, curious even. Then Dr. Whitfield's own cat, a sleek black female named Midnight, appeared on the other side of the glass door that separated the living room from the hallway that led to the kitchen. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Churchill's fur stood on end, making him look twice his normal size. He let out a yowl that could have awakened the dead, then launched himself at the nearest piece of furniture, an antique side table that held a collection of delicate porcelain figurines. The crash was spectacular. Figurines flew in every direction, the table toppled over, and Churchill, apparently satisfied with the destruction, stalked back to his carrier and sat down with an expression of grim satisfaction. Dr. Whitfield stared at the wreckage of her collection, her mouth hanging open. "Well, that's never happened before. I am so sorry," I said, frantically trying to gather the broken pieces. "I'll pay for everything, of course. I had no idea he would react like that to another cat. He doesn't seem to care for the other animals at the shelter." "It's quite all right, dear," Dr. Whitfield said, though her voice was strained. "But I think it's clear that Churchill is not ready for a multi-cat household. And honestly, I don't have the energy to orchestrate a long adaptation right now." The drive back to the shelter was silent, except for Churchill's occasional satisfied chirp from his carrier. I was beginning to understand why he'd been asked to leave so many places. The second home visit was with the Kowalski family, who had specifically requested a cat that would be good with their elderly father, who was recovering from a stroke. They lived in a quiet ranch house with a large enclosed porch that would be perfect for a cat who needed gentle exercise. This time, I was prepared. I'd brought Churchill's favorite toys, his special food, and even a pheromone spray that was supposed to have a calming effect. I'd also warned the family about his tendency toward dramatic reactions. "We're not easily intimidated," Mrs. Kowalski assured me as we set up Churchill's temporary space on the porch. "Dad's had cats his whole life, and we know they can be particular." Mr. Kowalski Sr. was waiting in his wheelchair, his weathered hands extended toward Churchill's carrier. "Come on out, big guy. Let's have a look at you." Churchill emerged cautiously, and for a moment I thought we might have found his match. The old man's voice seemed to soothe him, and Churchill actually approached the wheelchair, sniffing curiously at Mr. Kowalski's outstretched hand. "That's it. You're a handsome fellow, aren't you?" Churchill seemed to consider this, tilting his head as he studied Mr. Kowalski's face. Then, without warning, he reached out with his one front paw and knocked the man's glasses clean off his face. "Churchill," I gasped, but Mr. Kowalski was laughing. "Feisty one, isn't he?" he said, fumbling for his glasses. "I like that in a cat." For a moment, I thought we'd found Churchill's home. But then Mrs. Kowalski's grandson arrived, a boisterous 10-year-old who burst through the door like a small tornado. "Grandpa, Mom said you got a new cat. Where is he? Can I pet him?" Churchill took one look at the energetic child and made a beeline for the highest point he could reach, the top of a tall bookshelf. From there, he glared down at us like an angry gargoyle, occasionally letting out warning yowls when the boy got too close. "Maybe he just needs time to adjust," Mrs. Kowalski suggested hopefully, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We spent 2 hours trying to coax Churchill down from the bookshelf. He finally came down on his own, only after the grandson had left for soccer practice. By then, it was clear that this wasn't going to work either. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Kowalski said, as I loaded a sulking Churchill back into his carrier. "He seems like a wonderful cat, but with Tommy visiting so often, I understand completely," I said, though my heart was sinking. We were down to 10 days, and I was running out of potential homes. The third attempt was with a single woman named Janet Morrison, who worked from home as a freelance graphic designer. She lived in a quiet apartment with no other pets, no children, and a lifestyle that seemed perfect for a cat who needed routine and minimal disruption. "I've always preferred older cats," Janet explained as we set up Churchill's things in her spare bedroom. "They're calmer, more settled, and I don't mind that he's missing a leg. I think it makes him special." Churchill seemed to approve of Janet's apartment. It was quiet, orderly, and filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that cats love. He explored methodically, checking every room before settling on a sunny spot by the living room window. "He seems to like it here," Janet said, watching Churchill groom himself in the afternoon sunlight. "He's really quite beautiful, isn't he?" For 3 hours, Everything went perfectly. Churchill napped in the sun, ate his dinner without incident, and even allowed Janet to sit near him while she worked on her laptop. I was beginning to think we'd finally found his match. Then Janet's neighbor started practicing violin. The sound was muffled by the apartment walls, but it was clearly audible. A beginner working through scales with more enthusiasm than skill. Churchill's ears flattened against his head, and he began to pace. "Oh, that's just Britta," Janet said dismissively. "She practices every evening from 6 to 8. You get used to it after a while." Churchill, apparently, had no intention of getting used to it. As the violin practice continued, he became increasingly agitated. He stalked around the apartment, his tail lashing, his eyes wild. Then, with a yowl of pure outrage, he launched himself at the window where the sound was coming from. The impact was tremendous. Churchill hit the glass with such force that I was amazed it didn't shatter. Instead, he bounced off and landed on Janet's desk, scattering papers and knocking over a cup of coffee that splashed across her computer keyboard. "Oh no!" Janet cried, frantically trying to save her work. "My laptop!" Churchill, meanwhile, had moved on to his next target, a bookshelf filled with carefully arranged art books. He began systematically knocking them to the floor, one by one, his expression suggesting that this was somehow the violin's fault. "Churchill, stop!" I pleaded, but he was beyond reason. The violin practice had triggered something primal in him, and he was determined to make his displeasure known. By the time I managed to get him back into his carrier, Janet's apartment looked like a tornado had hit it. Coffee dripped from her desk, books were scattered across the floor, and her laptop screen was flickering ominously. "I'm so sorry," I said for what felt like the 100th time that week. "I'll pay for the laptop, of course." I had no idea he would react like that to music. Janet was surprisingly gracious about the whole thing. She said, "It's not your fault, but I think it's clear that Churchill needs a very specific type of environment, maybe somewhere without neighbors." As I drove back to the shelter with the now calm Churchill purring innocently in his carrier, I felt the weight of failure settling on my shoulders. We were down to a week, and I was no closer to finding Churchill a home than I'd been when this whole thing started. That night, I sat in Churchill's room at the shelter, watching him groom himself with the meticulous care that cats bring to everything they do. He seemed completely unbothered by the day's disasters, as if destroying apartments was just part of his normal routine. "What am I going to do with you?" I asked him. "Mrs. Ashworth must have known how difficult you are. Why would she set such an impossible condition?" Churchill paused in his grooming to look at me, his green eyes reflecting the overhead lights. For a moment, I could swear he was trying to tell me something. Over the next few days, I threw myself into finding Churchill a home with renewed desperation. I contacted cat behaviorists, hoping they might have suggestions for managing his issues. I reached out to sanctuaries that specialized in unadoptable animals. I even posted on online forums, hoping someone, somewhere, might be willing to take on the challenge. The responses were always the same: sympathy, but no solutions. With 3 days left, I was forced to face the possibility that I might actually fail. The thought of losing $3 million was devastating, but what bothered me more was the idea that Churchill might end up in some institutional setting, spending his remaining years without the love and attention he deserved. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. I was sitting in Churchill's room, as I did every evening, talking to him about my day and my worries. He was perched on his favorite windowsill, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that almost matched his fur. "You know what the problem is?" I said to him. "Everyone who meets you expects you to be grateful. They expect you to be easy, to fit into their lives without any disruption. But that's not who you are, is it?" Churchill turned to look at me, his expression unusually attentive. "You're not looking for just any home. You're looking for the right home. Someone who understands that you're not broken or difficult. You're just particular. You have standards." As I said the words, I felt something click into place in my mind. Churchill wasn't unadoptable because he was mean or aggressive. He was unadoptable because he was grieving, scared, and desperately trying to maintain some control in a world that had been turned upside down. He needed someone who understood that his behavior wasn't personal, it was protective. Someone who was willing to earn his trust slowly, patiently, without expecting immediate gratitude or affection. Someone like me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Over the past 3 weeks, Churchill and I had developed a routine. He followed me around the shelter, sat with me during my lunch breaks, and had even started sleeping on the couch in my office. He didn't hiss at me anymore, didn't try to knock things over when I was around. With me, he was calm, curious, even affectionate in his own reserved way. I'd been so focused on finding him a home that I'd missed the obvious truth. He'd already found one. But adopting Churchill myself would mean giving up the $3 million. It would mean watching the shelter struggle, possibly even close. It would mean letting down all the animals who could have been saved with that money. I spent the next 2 days agonizing over the decision. I made lists of pros and cons, calculated how long the shelter could survive without the inheritance, and tried to figure out if there was any other way. On the final day, with just hours left before the deadline, I sat in my office with Churchill curled up on my lap, purring softly as I scratched behind his ears. He'd been doing this more often lately, seeking out physical contact, showing affection in small but meaningful ways. "What do you think, Churchill?" I asked him. "Should I keep looking for someone else to love you, or should I just admit that I'm the one who's fallen for your grumpy charm?" Churchill looked up at me with those intelligent green eyes, and I could swear he was smiling. I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Pemberton's number. "Miss Thornton," he answered on the first ring. "I was expecting your call. Have you found Churchill a home?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, I have. I'm adopting him myself." There was a long pause. "I see. And you understand what this means for the inheritance?" "I understand that I'm choosing Churchill's well-being over the money. I know I've failed the test, but I can't, in good conscience, place him with someone else when I know he's happy here with me." Another pause, longer this time. Then, to my surprise, Mr. Pemberton chuckled. "Miss Thornton, I think you should come to my office. There's something Mrs. Ashworth wanted me to tell you, but only if you made a very specific choice." An hour later, I sat in the same conference room where this whole adventure had begun, Churchill in his carrier beside me. Mr. Pemberton was smiling, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Miss Thornton, Mrs. Ashworth was a very wise woman. She knew Churchill better than anyone, and she knew exactly what kind of person he would need." "I don't understand." "The condition in her will wasn't really about finding Churchill any home. It was about finding him the right home, someone who would choose his well-being over personal gain, someone who would love him not despite his flaws, but because of who he is." Mr. Pemberton pulled out another document. "Mrs. Ashworth was very specific about this. If the person charged with finding Churchill a home chose to adopt him themselves, sacrificing the inheritance for his welfare, then that person would prove themselves worthy of both Churchill and the money." I stared at him, not daring to believe what I was hearing. "You mean—" "I mean, congratulations, Miss Thornton. You've passed the real test. The $3 million is yours. And Churchill has found exactly the home Mrs. Ashworth hoped he would, with someone who truly understands what it means to love an animal unconditionally. I looked down at Churchill, who was watching me through the mesh of his carrier with what I could swear was a smug expression. "You knew, didn't you? You knew all along." Churchill's purr was so loud it filled the entire conference room. 6 months later, I was sitting in the expanded office of Paws and Heart's animal shelter, watching Churchill hold court from his favorite perch by the window. The $3 million inheritance had transformed everything. We'd moved to a larger facility, hired additional staff, and were now able to help 3 times as many animals as before. But the best part wasn't the money or the expansion. It was coming home every evening to a grumpy, 3-legged cat who taught me that sometimes the most difficult animals to love are the ones who need love the most. Churchill had settled into his role as the shelter's unofficial mascot with typical feline dignity. He supervised all operations from his various perches, occasionally deigning to interact with visitors who met his exacting standards. He'd even become something of a therapy cat for the other animals, somehow sensing which ones needed comfort and offering his presence in his own reserved way. "You know," Mason said one evening, as we watched Churchill carefully grooming a nervous kitten who'd just arrived, "I think Mrs. Ashworth knew exactly what she was doing." "How do you mean?" "I mean, she didn't just leave you money to save animals. She left you, Churchill, to teach you something about what it really means to rescue the ones everyone else has given up on." I looked at Churchill, who had finished grooming the kitten and was now settling down for a nap, the little one curled up against his warm side. Despite his reputation for being difficult, he'd become the heart of our shelter, proof that every animal, no matter how challenging, deserves a chance at love. Mrs. Ashworth's final test hadn't been about finding Churchill a home. It had been about finding someone who would choose love over convenience, commitment over comfort, and the welfare of one difficult cat over $3 million. I thought I was failing her test when I decided to adopt Churchill myself. Instead, I'd passed it in the only way that mattered, by proving that some things are more valuable than money, and that the animals who are hardest to love are often the ones who need it most. An absolutely beautiful story about unconditional love, the true meaning of animal rescue, and how sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest blessings. What's the most challenging pet you've ever loved? Share your stories in the comments below. If this story of Churchill, Violet, and the power of choosing love over money touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories about the bonds between humans and animals. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.